This is the Bio 182, Chapter 45 lecture on how climate affects the distribution of species on Earth. So the first thing we want to understand a little better is what climate is. And climate is the weather patterns that we see in a particular region. The most important aspects of climate are temperature and rainfall, so the amount of precipitation. Climate determines what type of biome that a community makes up. So when we look at temperature, there's huge variety in temperatures across the Earth. When we look at latitude, we see that temperatures change going north or south of the equator. And this is based on how long or short the distance between the Earth and the sun's rays are. The shorter the distance, the warmer the climate. The longer the distance, the colder the climate. As well, higher latitudes have an oblique angle toward them, and so it spreads out even more than the equatorial regions that have a straight head-on angle. And finally, when we see these increases, the temperature will increase as the amount of solar radiation increases. And so the further away from the sun, the less solar radiation is hitting that point in the Earth, where when you look at the direct hits, they're coming straight on. They have nowhere else to go. These oblique angles are bending around and coming not directly into the fire, so to speak. So the other thing that we look at, aside from temperature, is precipitation. And the way this works is through the circulation of air. And so atmospheric circulation and precipitation, or rainfall, are influenced by solar energy. One of the things we call the hemispheres are convection cells, and this is a way that warm and cool air are moved around based on the solar energy. And so the equator has lots of warmth, and it gets that direct sunlight, which causes air to rise because heat rises. This rising air flows north and south toward the poles. As the air cools, it falls and flows back in toward the equator as rainfall. Now, one of the problems is that as the warm air pushes up and it starts to cool and come down, there's more warm air pushing up. And so it kind of gets trapped. And that's how we see different weather patterns form. One of the things we look at are the subsidence zones, and these are areas of high pressure. When we have real high pressure, it's typically a site for a desert. And when we look at how the air flows in the subsidence zone, from the surface it splits in two different directions. And at one side it goes toward the pole, the other side it goes toward the equator. And so the high pressure there creates a desert climate. The intertropical convergence zone, or ITCZ, is an equatorial flow where both hemispheres meet, so they're coming the same way. It still follows the solar equator, but typically drifts north or south, and that will vary between the Tropic of Capricorn, the equator, and the Tropic of Cancer. So if you look at this image, you can see how those weather patterns, or that the precipitation patterns, vary from that Tropic of Capricorn, the equator, and the Tropic of Cancer. And it depends on the months of the year. And this is how we see seasons. So as the amount of rainfall changes, as well, the length of the day is changing. And that is how we can signify the seasons, right? The winter has shorter days and the summer has longer days, right? And we can see more rainfall in certain areas during certain months. So tropical rainfall is seasonal. About 20 degrees north and south of the equator, they each have 2 rainy seasons. They are both 4 months long, like 3 to 4 months long. And then the equator has a real rainy season as well that is not part of either of the other two, and it is about 4 to 5 months long. So we'll have a rainy season at the equator, and then it shifts when the weather patterns shift, right? And so then all of a sudden maybe the Tropic of Cancer has a rainy season and it's coming down toward the equator, and then the Tropic of Capricorn has a rainy season. And so these changes in latitude vary the amount or the pattern that we see with precipitation. Now, years and years and years later, we're looking at a 3-cell model instead of just the hemispheres. And so at the equator to 30 degrees are typically tropical forests. From about 30 to 60 degrees, the climate we see are temperate, deciduous forests, and then more toward the north would be grasslands. And then at the poles, we see an Arctic tundra. And so we see this going up and down both ways, right? And so the circulation between that 30 and 60 degrees latitude is the opposite of what the next closest would be. So high precipitation occurs typically between 45 and 55 degrees. When we think about this, the Arctic tundra isn't going to be getting a lot of precipitation. So if we look at the ITCZ, there's lots of precipitation. But if we go just a little north, we'll see there's a summer wet season and a winter dry season. Then we go a little more north and we hit about 30 degrees. And we're at the subtropical high, dry in all seasons. So it's like the desert, right? Go a little bit further north, we have really wet winters and dry summers. A little bit further north, and now we're hitting up by the 60 degrees. We see subpolar lows, ample precipitation in all seasons, but then we get to the polar high, where the tundra lies, and that's where we see hardly any precipitation at all. Another thing that affects the climate is the tilt and rotation of the Earth. And so the Earth is tilted on its axis, and it's tilted the rotation is tilted at about 23.5 degrees off the vertical. And this tilt is what causes the seasons. So we have a summer and a winter solstice, and the summer solstice would be June 21st, the winter solstice December 21st. But we also have spring and autumn equinox. And so all the locations in the northern and southern hemispheres have the same amount of solar radiation during the equinox. So the seasons change less in the spring and summer, more drastically in the summer and the winter. We also see a length of day change. And so the days become a little longer, like we have more sunlight in the summer than we do in the winter. And that's how in other states they have that daylight savings time, because the days get shorter in the winter, so they adjust their time. It started as a way for farmers to be able to continue farming during appropriate light hours. I don't know why they still do it, but regardless. So any seasonal changes are accompanied by changes in the amount of precipitation as well. So another thing we need to look at is the Coriolis force. And this adds the effect of the Earth's rotation to the weather patterns. And so one of the things we see is that because the Earth rotates, it deflects the flow of wind off the surface. And so because of this rotation, we see hurricanes that come, and in the northern hemispheres, they spin counterclockwise, but in the southern hemisphere, they spin clockwise, and that's all because of the direction of the Earth's rotation. and the tilt of the axis. And so one of the other things we notice is that if we have someone standing at the North Pole and we fire a rocket to the equator, because the Earth is spinning, it will not go in a straight line. It will actually go to the west. Because the Earth is turning, the rocket will actually wind up moving toward the west. Other things that we look at when it comes to the climate are elevation and the proximity of a landmass to water. And the proximity to water is incredibly important when it comes to temperature because precipitation is due to an increase or decrease in water. Adiabatic cooling is increased elevation. So as we go up in elevation, 1,000 meters, we're going to drop 10 degrees Celsius. This is why tops of mountains are colder than bottoms of mountains. This is why Flagstaff is always colder than here in the valley. The other thing we look at with mountain ranges is rain shadow. And this is really interesting that on one side of a mountain, you could have this lush, beautiful landscape, and on the other side, it's a desert, right? And so the warm, moist air flows up the mountain, cools, and releases the precipitation. But on the opposite side, all that dry air just drops down. There's like no precipitation on the other side because there's no warm, moist air. And that's how we see dry deserts on one side of a mountain versus the lush landscape on another. So land masses, they definitely affect our climates as well. One thing we see is in coastal areas, the sea breeze is an amazing temperature changer. So during the day, the land heats up, and so our air's rising, and it pulls that cool ocean air in. At night, the land cools so quick, way quicker than the water cools, and all of a sudden, it reverses, and so we get an offshore breeze. So the sea moderates the coastal or island temperatures that we see. And this is why we get these beautiful, cool daytime breezes, but then at night, the land is super cool. And so it's trying to cool the sea. Another thing that affects climate are ocean currents. And so the way that the water moves based on different rotation of the earth. This also creates wind. The wind also attributes to the ocean currents, and so winds create little ripples in the water, and that's going to create waves as well. And we also have to look at the effect of tides going in and out. So major ocean currents are like a pinwheel between continents, and it's spinning in the northern hemisphere clockwise. Oddly, in the southern hemisphere, counterclockwise. It makes sense that they're different, but so much different that in the air, the hurricane is the opposite. So when we look at like the Gulf Stream, right, this is going to bring tons of warm water in from the Caribbean and the U.S. coast, and it brings it out to the Atlantic Ocean. So it combines with the North Atlantic drift, and it makes a really moderate climate in Europe. The flow of the Gulf Stream is 50 times more powerful than that of all the rivers in the world combined. The other current we see is the Humboldt current, and this brings cool conditions to the western coast of South America near the equator. And so this current is cooling areas of South America that really need it. And that's how we see beautiful weather out there in some of the tropical regions as well. And then the California current is the third, and it brings cool climates to the Hawaiian Islands. So waves, we mentioned waves a minute ago, and this friction from the air and the water makes those tiny ripples. And as the wind pushes against this tiny ripple, it makes it increase in size. If the wind is very hard and quick, it's going to make a huge wave. But also, the fetch matters, and the fetch is the distance on the top of the water. So when you look at like a lake or a river, they have a very small distance across the top of the body of water versus the sea. The ocean is so expansive that contributes to how large the waves can get. Also, it depends on the duration of time that the wind is blowing on the waves or on the water and how deep the water goes. The deeper the water, the bigger the wave can get. And then finally, we talk about tides. And so the tide is the rise and fall of the level of the sea. And we see this when we're walking on the beaches next to a sea. The tides go out, and then we can see all the little sandbars. The tides come in, and then we're back to the water. And we don't see the sandbars and little life on the low areas or tide pools that form. The tidal range varies over a 2-week cycle, and it's caused by the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon. But the moon's force is 2.2 times stronger than that of the sun, because the moon is so much closer to us than the sun is. So we have a couple tides. One is a spring tide and one is a neap tide. So the sun, earth, and moon align in a straight pattern. This is a huge tidal force. It's called the spring tide. And then when the sun, earth, and moon form a 90-degree angle, the tide is very minimal, and it's called a neap tide. So when we talk about communities and climate, we're discussing the biomes of the world. So there are 10 biomes. We have hot deserts and cold deserts, tropical grasslands and temperate grasslands, tropical deciduous forests and temperate deciduous forests, tropical rainforests, temperate rainforests, taiga and tundra. Not all communities fit into one of the 10 types. Sometimes things fit into more than one. So these biomes are typically based on average precipitation or rainfall and the temperature. So huge communities of organisms interacting together with their climate forms the biome. When we look at how biomes are separated, we can see across the earth the geographic separation. And we see that so much of the earth is covered by some aspects, like the hot desert, right? There's a lot of hot desert. There's a lot of tropical rainforest. Not quite as much polar ice cap, luckily for us, right? But there's a lot of tundra. We don't see a lot of cold desert, but there is some. So as we're looking at these, we can see how the different patterns moving away from the equator are creating these different biome changes. One thing to note in this particular depiction is that they include temperate rainforests and taiga together, and that's because they have very, very similar species of trees found all throughout these two areas, and because there's so very little temperate rainforest, they just combine them into one because almost all of it is taiga anyway, but it's very similar to this temperate rainforest. So there are some aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes are like marine aquatic biomes and intertidal zones. The intertidal zones are the areas of tide pools where when the tide goes out, you can see what happens on the sandbars. You can see some of that life there. Coral reefs, and then the open ocean. Then we see freshwater habitats, which are like lakes and rivers, and also wetlands, so like swamps and things, right? The aquatic biomes are distinguished by differences in temperature, but also salinity, which is salt, oxygen content, depth, current strength, and availability to light. The higher it is, the more light they have available. The lower it is, the less light. So you're not going to find photosynthetic organisms at the bottom of the sea, right? One of the things that we look at with terrestrial biomes are things like forests, right? We can see tropical forests, and there's a tiger. We can see temperate forests, which are also like the taiga, right? We can see grasslands, which is like a savanna, a very tropical climate. There are hot deserts and then tundra. And the tundra doesn't always only have snow, right? But these are some of the climates that we see in terrestrial locations. So next we talk about continental drift and biogeography. And we see that biomes don't exactly explain why species are distributed the way they are. Part of it is evolution, and part of it is geological change. So part is the biome, but part is change in geology over time, the history of the earth, right? So there are similar biomes in the world that have very distinct species. So South America contains sloths and anteaters and armadillos and monkeys. But in Africa, that same biome has antelopes and zebras and giraffes, baboons, okapi, and aardvarks, right? Australia, totally different. There we see those monotremes, right? The platypus and the echidna. Then we see Tasmanian devils and wombats, all the marsupials, stuff that we don't see anywhere else. Same climate, right? So the biomes are the same, but the life is different. Species distribution is different. A lot of deserts have succulents. South American deserts, tons of cacti. African deserts, not so much, right? So are the different species around because of abiotic factors, so non-life factors? And the answer is no. Some species can be introduced into an area to test that idea. So the reason we see different flora and fauna are because of independent evolution of separate, unconnected populations. So they generate totally different species in different places, even with the same climates. And the reason we see a lot of this is because of continental drift. And then, of course, the role evolution plays in the distribution of species across the entire Earth. So one thing we can look at when we're trying to think about how these species diverge is the tapir. Widely separate populations of these species exist. And the distribution, it used to be incredibly vast, but as the world changed, then the organisms change as well. And now there are 4 distinct species of tapir. 3 are in Central and South America, 1's in Malaysia. The fossil record shows it used to be tapirs all over Europe, Asia, North America. They pinpoint the origin of an ancestral species to Europe. But with global cooling, we're wiping out the tapirs. They can only sustain life in these tropical areas. So knowing that they all came from Europe, how would we think, where did they all get to these other places, right? And we can see the reason that these different species of tapir exist in these different locations are from various ways that the Earth has changed throughout the history of the Earth and the way evolution occurs in organisms. And that's how we see new species arise. So when we look at the biogeographic regions of the Earth, we can thank Wallace, right? Our good old buddy that Darwin, liked to share his ideas with. Alfred Russel Wallace. He saw that plants and animals were often restricted to only certain geographic regions, and so he named them. He divided all the world's biota into 6 major biogeographic regions. The Nearctic, Palearctic, Neotropical, Ethiopian, Oriental, and Australian. So we see different organisms and different plants arise in these different biota. And if we look at this image, we can see in these different biota are how we see the tropical and the temperate climates, the forests or the taiga. We see the grasslands and the tundra. We see deserts and mangroves. So we can see our terminology for different biomes in the biogeographical depictions that Wallace suggested. One of the things that we see as a major barrier to the organism dispersal is oceans and mountain ranges. And the two main mountain ranges that we look at, Rocky Mountains and the Himalayas, right? And then deserts. So the Sahara Desert, the Himalayas, and all the oceans are keeping organisms in check in their areas and not allowing them to just go crazy all over the globe. And that is going to wrap up our lecture on climate and biomes.